Hi, and welcome back to Reverse Shot, the show where we turn the camera around, take a look at the foibles, mistakes, and some of the good things that corporate media does today. I'm your host, Brian Karam, 40 years of experience doing this stuff, so I hope to enlighten you a little bit, have a little fun while doing it, and of course, point out the best and the worst of the media. Speaking of which, let's go to the worst first. Isn't that fun? I want you to take a look at what happened this week in the White House Brady briefing room. That's right. That's where the press secretary comes to debunk, debrief, and inform the media from around the world. This week, I want you to take a look at one of the questions that happened in the Brady briefing room. Take a look.
Different topic. Since when does the vice president have what sounds like a southern accent?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well,
I mean, this is...
she was talking about unions in Detroit using one tone of voice.
Is this something that you think...
Same line...
Okay, Peter,
that she used the same line in Pittsburgh, and it sounded like she at least had some kind of a southern drawl.
I mean, do you hear the question that you're... I mean, do you think Americans seriously think that this is an important question? They care... You know what they care about? They care about the economy. They care about lowering costs. They care about health care. That's what Americans care about.
So
that's what they want to hear.
This is something...
They care about, your colleague just asked me about, what basically we talked about, went back and forth about democracy and freedom. That's what they care about. I'm not even going to entertain some question about the press. It's just, hearing it sounds so ridiculous.
Well, but hearing it is...
The question, I'm talking about the questions, is just insane.
Is that how she talks in meetings here?
I'm just, Peter, we're moving on. We're still moving around. Go ahead, Anita.
Thanks.
Okay, let's break this down for you, can we? This is the White House Brady briefing room. That is the presidential press secretary. She is there to take questions and answer questions about policy, sometimes the president's personal life when it interferes with his work or collides or otherwise coalesces with his work, but mostly it's about what the president does for this country, why he's doing it, and she's there to answer those questions. She's not there to answer any questions about the vice president or the vice presidential campaign or the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or Beavis and Butthead or anything else. No, Beavis and Butthead are sometimes in a press briefing room asking questions, but that's another story. Anyway, that's the worst of it, okay? That's not why she's there. Those aren't questions that you want to ask. And here's something that comes to mind every time I see something like that. I go back to Mike McCurry and Joe Lockhart, who were press secretaries for Bill Clinton. And at the time, back in the day, there was a defrocked minister who came into the White House briefing room every day and was sometimes called upon, and he often asked questions about Bigfoot, aliens, not illegal immigrants, but aliens from the planet Zatar or whatever, or the Loch Ness Monster, a bunch of other stuff. And one day I remember, I think it was Mike McCurry, one reporter said, "Why do you call on that guy all the time?" And he said, "Because he makes the rest of you look stupid." Congratulations, that's exactly what that question does for the rest of the press corps, and it angers people who say, "Whatever happened to the press?" Well, we're still there, but they call on us sometimes because they want to show how stupid we are, and it's real easy these days. Now, let's take a look at the other side of the coin. This is the best of the press. Take a look.
So, Daniel, let's start with this claim about Iran and terror. Listen.
Iran was broke. They didn't have the money for Hamas and for Hezbollah. They didn't have the money for anybody. We went 4 years without any blow-ups. We had no World Trade Center blow-up. We had no radical Islamic terror. We had no radical Islamic terror.
What say you, Daniel?
I say there are two claims there, and they're both false. So first, this claim that Iran did not have money for Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terror groups during his presidency, that's wrong, as his own administration acknowledged in 2020. Iran continued funding these terror groups throughout his presidency, although it did reduce funding, experts say, when it came under sanctions pressure from Trump. And then the second claim that we had no radical Islamic terror is also wrong. There were terror attacks by Islamic extremists under Trump. There was one that Trump repeatedly lamented during his presidency. It was the attack that killed 8 people on the West Side Highway in New York. DOJ alleged it was carried out in support of ISIS. And then, of course, there was a 2019 attack by an extremist member of the Saudi military on a U.S. Military facility that killed 3 U.S. Navy sailors. DOJ alleged that that was carried out by a jihadist who was a longtime associate of an al-Qaeda group.
Yeah, that's Daniel Dale doing exactly what the press should be doing, fact-checking. I don't really care if you're going to come to me and tell me you're a truth teller. Whose truth? The facts. My arrogance, I want to tell you vetted, factual information. And that's what Daniel Dale is doing. Vetting the facts and letting you decide the truth based on that. The fact is, Donald Trump is running for president. The truth? Well, if you hear it from Trump supporters, the truth is Jesus is bringing him to us and putting him in office because Jesus wants him there. That's their truth. My truth? I think he's avoiding prosecution. And the whole reason why he's running for office is because he wants to stay out of prison. The truth? Well, that may be a fact, but I'll tell you what the fact is. He is running. So, when you can discern between facts and fantasy, and you vet these facts, you can decide what the truth is. The truth is, we should all decide our truths based on vetted facts, not invented ones. So, tip of the hat to CNN and Daniel Dale for doing that. Now, let's get to this week's interview because this is a lot of fun. With me today is former press secretary from the Clinton White House, Joe Lockhart. And Joe, I guess we're going to start out by talking, I want to know, you see what passes for the press today. One of the things that people are griping about is a New York Times article. These are opinion pieces, mind you. Joy isn't a political strategy, taking aim at the Harris campaign, and Trump can win on character. And a lot of people got upset because they felt like the New York Times wasn't doing their job. I like to hear what other people say, even if I don't agree with them. But there has been an overall change in the press since you were in the White House. Sure. What do you think the biggest difference is, and how do we fix it?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest difference is it doesn't matter what happens because tomorrow we'll be on to something else. And one of the more startling things about the Biden coverage was they stuck with it as long as they did and didn't get distracted. And, I think I don't know what they could have done, the Biden people, to move it along, but that's why he had to drop out. Because he had stemmed the tide for a while. But the press had just decided that, for once they were going to stay with something and they couldn't be moved off. And that in its own way is not fair. But it is what it is. The other thing I'd say is, and this is 99% related to Trump, but the sort of normalizing aberrant behavior is absurd. Every single day he lies 100 times. Is every single day in the story the next day that he lies? No. Every single day he says incredibly offensive things that are misogynist, racist, xenophobic. Do we see those stories? It's this assumption among the press that, well, everybody already knows this. Well, everybody knew Joe Biden was old. Yet for 5 weeks running, that's the only story they could do. So I think, it's everyone in politics, no matter what your view is, always argue they're being treated unfairly. But I have never, ever in 40 years of doing this seen such an unbalanced set of standards for what you hold a candidate to, and never that one that's as disadvantageous to a party. Trump gets away with almost everything. If Joe Biden or Kamala Harris says 1% of what Trump says, it's hold the press, and it is a complete failure. And I think a lot of the press has kind of given up on this. And there's this very odd thing that happens. The press is in the business of holding people accountable, but is the worst at holding themselves accountable. And what happens is It's not they don't know the problems, but their argument is, well, we're in the middle of the campaign. How can we make a big change here? We'll go to a conference after the campaign and discuss it. Well, it doesn't matter after the campaign, that discussion. What matters is happening in the campaign. And, there's not a political candidate or a CEO or a entertainment figure who's able to say, as soon as this campaign's over, I'll address all those issues that you have with me.
Yeah, and we never address
it.
it.
Just sort of seamlessly says, yeah, there's a big problem here, not with me, but with everybody else, and we're going to talk about it afterwards. Give me a break.
Well, let's drill down on that a little bit. Why do you think that is? I've heard it say that some people believe that it's because, who owns the press, and then there are others simply say it's a function of money because it makes more money to keep talking about Donald Trump than anything else. Do you think there's a political impetus behind it, or do you think it's solely driven by money?
Well, I think a lot of the coverage, particularly in the digital sphere, is based on what will grab the most attention, not what is the most important.
That's a function of money.
And that is a function of money. But this sort of non-critical look at your own profession predates the internet.
Oh, well, yes, it does.
I mean, there's just a sense that you're all hacks. And being a journalist is a vocation. It's a calling. And actually, I think it is a calling, but so is government service and politics. It's the example I used in something I wrote recently, and it was on Facebook, so you can go find it if you want. But there were probably 200 people who liked it or commented on it. And I went in and counted, and there were something like 40 former journalists. So you have to be a former journalist to step up and say a lot of this stuff, but I give them credit for that. And part of it is just who my friends are. It's like...
Well, I'll say it even though I'm a current journalist, but that's why we're here and not on NBC.
Right, but what I wrote about was, and says some of your listeners and viewers might not be aware of this. I don't know what the details are, so I'm not going to like spill the beans on something. But I know in 2016, emails were illegally obtained from Hillary Clinton's campaign. Mostly John Podesta's emails, and they were spread over, including John Podesta's recipes for, a dinner party that had no bearing on anything. And all of it was now there are documents and emails that have been stolen from the Trump campaign that the media is not reporting on. And when asked about the double standard, they give a nonsense answer that they'd never accept from a politician, which is, we judge everything based on the facts, and and I wrote, there's a very simple way to deal with this, which is to say, in 2016 we did this, we reported on it. In hindsight, we realized that was wrong. We shouldn't have done that, and we've actually learned something. And just repeating a mistake for fairness is not the way we should go. I mean, and it's simple, just own the problem. Admit that you got it wrong. As an institution, incapable of doing that. Incapable of saying, in 2016, we fundamentally got this wrong by using illegal and damaging emails. And it's not they didn't learn. They have learned. They've changed their behavior, but they won't acknowledge why, which creates the impression among Democrats of, well, you're just trying to help Republicans. Which is, I don't think the case is. I think the case is they learned something from that. But if you don't acknowledge the mistake, who else is going to learn from it?
And what did your 40 reporter friends who responded, what did they say?
They agreed.
Yeah.
And now that, people primarily who are out of the business understand that sort of self-righteousness doesn't help them and contributes to the distrust of the media. There's nothing better for a politician or a corporate CEO to make a mistake and stand up there and take responsibility for it, even if it's not even their mistake, because that's authentic. That's something that every person has to do at some point in their life, and it's what separates people. the people who can do that and the people who can't. And the majority of the country is people who can. But, you wonder why people don't trust the media. And I think most of it's unfair. I do trust the media. I don't agree with a lot of the coverage. But I don't think there's people out there trying to lie, with the exception.
Well, I do, but I think there's
with the exception of the genre of Fox News and
yeah.
all the people to the right of them, which is, they're not journalists. They're
they're
corporate
not.
shows.
Although they pretend they are.
Yeah, and but if you can't stand up and say we made a mistake and we've learned from it, then next time around you're going to make a different mistake.
And you're not going to learn.
Or you're going to do the right thing, and people aren't going to trust that you're doing the right thing.
That's, you bring up a very interesting point that I have talked about before, and this is newspapers and television stations used to have ombudsmen. These are mistakes that were made. We correct them in the paper. On page 3 last week we said this, but actually it was that. And you print. Now, people used to gripe that the mistake was made on page 1 and the ombudsman was on page 3, but it was there. There used to be television ombudsmen who would come on after a newscast and go, we did this wrong last week, we're setting the record straight.
Really on local news, local TV used to have them. I remember those.
Yeah, we don't do that anymore. In fact, I think it's one of the largest reasons why we've lost our audience, because people don't believe us. Everyone makes a mistake. Own it. I think the last of the institutions that held on to that was the New York Times, and they let her go. And my experience was it was a great place to go and make your case that you've been treated unfairly. Yeah.
I would say of the 10 times I've appealed to ombudsman, maybe 3 times they came out and wrote something saying we got this wrong. So it wasn't like something you expected, but I would come away from it feeling better that we were heard, and even if they didn't acknowledge it publicly, it would get into the bloodstream, and the next time things might. I'll tell you one, kind of funny story on the transition here, which is when during Lewinsky, there was this report out that someone had testified to something before the grand jury, and it was damaging. And the Wall Street Journal reporter, Glenn Simpson, who became famous in the Hillary campaign for the work he did, called me at 10 o'clock in the morning and said, "Here's what we have." And I said, "What time do I have to respond? I got it. I got to try to run this down." He said, 5 o'clock. That's my first deadline. I went and I ran it down, and I found out an important fact, which is the person in question hadn't testified yet. Now, he likely was going to testify to that, but he hadn't. So they couldn't run the story. And I called Glenn at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon and said, "Glenn, you got to kill that." He said, "Why?" And I said, "I can tell you with great authority, so-and-so has not testified yet." And he goes, "How do you know?" I said, "I just talked to his lawyer. I'm helping you out here." He called me back.
You should have talked to his lawyer.
Yeah. Well, I think his lawyer wouldn't talk to him. But anyway, he called back 5 minutes later and said, "We have a problem." And he explained that they had just put it out on the Dow Jones Newswire because they were afraid of getting scooped. And I said, "Glenn, I don't have a problem. You have a problem." And he said, "Well, we're going to correct it on the Dow Jones Newswire." I said, "That's not nearly good enough. The Wall Street Journal has put their credibility on the line for this story, and putting on the Dow Jones Newswire, retracting it means nothing." So I remember getting into this debate with Alan Murray, who was the bureau chief at the time, and a really fine journalist. And so is Glenn. None of this was This was a thing of the time. But I called him and I said, "My bottom line is you have to put a correction on the front page of the Wall Street Journal tomorrow. That's the only way reporters are going to know this didn't happen." And Alan, quite rightly, said, "I can't correct a story that wasn't in my newspaper." And I said, "Well, you have to, because otherwise people are going to believe it." And I think for the first time ever, a front page correction was printed in a paper that never wrote the underlying story.
Wow.
They were not happy that day. I was, I felt like I'd conquered the world for 3 months.
You did. Because rightly, if you didn't, why am I correcting somebody else's mistake?
Yes. But it wasn't somebody else's mistake. It was their, the putting an explosive story on their subsidiary was as powerful as putting it in the paper.
Yeah.
And the only way you could put the toothpaste back in the tube, not that you could completely, was having the big dog say, we messed up.
We screwed it up. Well, that's
Yeah.
one thing hey, to your point, we don't even have copy editors anymore. And there are, the so-called content creators are those who they will tell you their opinion. They're here, but they're not trained journalists, and they don't have, and I really don't think you can call yourself a journalist unless you have at least one person overlooking your copy going, hey, what is that? Where did you get that fact? Is that a fact? Is that your opinion? Because in the past, I've had young reporters I've mentored, and they'll come to me and they'll go, hey, I got a great idea. This is what I think. And I go, I don't give a shit what you think. I barely care what I think. What do you know? What can you verify as fact? We don't do much of that anymore. And that's part and parcel of... No, go ahead.
The corollary to that is, and I think at some point, whatever is in these Trump emails or whatever, somebody's going to print it. And then the reporters, the news organizations will all go out and cover it after deciding that they shouldn't, under the theory of it's out there.
It's already out there. Got to do it.
It's out there, so we got to cover. So your incredibly ethical, strong belief disappears because it's out there. And that happens all the time.
One of the early in my career, one of the stories that was like that was Henry Cisneros in San Antonio. I mean, my God, I'd go to get my hair cut, and they'd talk about Henry Cisneros having an affair on his wife. Nobody really printed it until one weekly newspaper decided to do it. And then everybody did it. And then poor Henry was sitting out there on the front lawn of his house, and he did like a 4-hour press conference in 2 different languages explaining his peccadillos. And afterwards he said, well, he came over to the station where I was doing an interview with him on a different subject. He goes, what do you think? And I said, if it were me, Henry, I would have stayed in the house, closed the curtains, and told us to fuck off. Because the Catholic guild didn't do it.
The thing that doesn't get discussed at journalism school, whoever goes to journalism school, is how can you on Monday say this is not relevant, it's personal, and all this, whether they're right or wrong, they take a principled decision, a thoughtful, principled decision. And on Tuesday, because a weekly newspaper puts out there, that principled decision is reversed in a second.
Well, then it's not a principled decision, is it? I mean, it's one of expediency. I don't deal with.
It's what I call situational ethics.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not a principled decision. It's a situationally ethical decision.
Yes.
We need to improve that. All right. So if you had your druthers, what would you like to see done to correct problems in journalism today? You've seen it from the government end. I've seen it from this end. But I'd love to know what you think we should do differently that we don't do now.
Well, I mean, boy, that's a hard question because it's easy to criticize it. It's hard to fix. I do think that at the root of a lot of this, not all of it, is that the media business has shifted from a vocation, loss leader, public service into a profit center.
Yes.
So if you look at, take the cable news networks, each of them made the decision that to be profitable, they couldn't go after all the viewers. They had to pick the ones they wanted to go after. So then the news is determined by what their viewers want to see. So MSNBC appeals to progressives, and Fox appeals to crazies, and CNN tries to buy the middle. And no one's as bad as Fox. I mean, Fox, I believe, is a criminal enterprise that does more damage than almost any institution in this country. I watched some of their convention coverage, and while Democrats were burning the house down Fox was outside for 2 hours with live coverage of the protesting, all 12 of them.
Yeah. Well,
And they kept talking about the police presence and violence may break out. Okay.
never did. Never. And I'll tell you what was funny, Joe. I went out to the protest. Now, look, what they were protesting about, I'm with. I understand. I get it, and I support it. But there was one group of protesters that were walking around screaming, "Genocide Joe, you must go," and on a bullhorn. And I said, "Excuse me, could I have a moment of your time?" And he goes, "What?" I go, "You do realize that Genocide Joe, he did go. He's not. You got to come up with a new tag.
No, you win, guys. You win.
You won." So, and he looked at me. He goes, "Oh shit, you're right." I go, I'm just saying. If you're going to shout a tagline, at least get the right candidate. But there was never any real violence. There was,
No, there wasn't. And I'm old enough to remember what happened in 1968. That was real violence in Chicago.
Yeah.
But the tailoring news to please your audience has flipped news on its head, which is it's not about telling people what they need to know, it's telling people what they want to know.
God, that's a great point.
And it is less pervasive among the major newspapers, but as they drift into being more digital actors, it is more prevalent.
Yeah, well, as they drift into smaller number of people owning a greater number of papers, it becomes that way as well.
Yeah, and then there's just the corporations dictating news to advantage the corporate bottom line.
Right.
But it's hard to understand which is the most insidious, but you put them all together. And what makes it a really hard question, coming back to the question, is, well, how do you fix that? Is the government supposed to make everything public broadcasting? That's not going to happen. I do think that some commitment to getting back to covering what's important as opposed to what's fascinating would help. But I don't know how you do that. I don't know if I was the editor of a big newspaper. I know the pep talk I'd give.
Right.
But I also know that if nobody read my newspaper, I'd be out of a job. And it's not the best career strategy to get yourself fired quickly. I've said for a long time, and I keep thinking it's going to happen, and it hasn't yet, that the public will have so many tools to properly curate information that will solve the problem. That traditional journalists become not irrelevant, but they're not nearly as important as they used to be. But a sideshow.
Except in that briefing room, they still dominate in that briefing room. They dominate the pool coverage. They dominate the travel pool coverage because they can afford to go. So those independent journalists don't have a voice in that.
If
and from being there how that pool works. How those things work.
Yep.
And so
I know from being there the advantage to doing it that way for me was.
For you, exactly. You're dealing with a smaller number of people. The constant interaction means that there is some ability, I don't want to say control, but to influence.
No, not control, but the ability to have your voice heard on a consistent basis.
And for them, it's the access that, being accessible more than anyone else gives you an advantage over everyone else in that room.
Yeah. I would, I'm thinking about your question. The other thing I'd say is, and it goes to what we were talking about, make ethics less situational. If you decide in the morning, this is what's news, don't worry about what everybody else is doing. People can find that someplace else if that's what they want. And don't be like a corporation that does everything based on quarterly earnings. Don't make decisions based on, at the end of the day, how many clicks you got on this story or that story. Sort of make principled decisions, and then put the blinders on and don't worry about what at the New York Times, what the Washington Post does, and at the Washington Post, what the Wall Street Journal does, and at NBC, what ABC does. Not
Oh
that,
yeah, we do a lot of that.
well, then I think the networks went from, if you look at the evolution of all of this, newspapers ran the whole show for a long time.
Yeah.
When I did my first campaign in 1980, the important players were the newspaper reporters.
Yeah.
And one of the genius of Mike Deaver, who was Reagan's image person, was to make television paramount in importance, is reaching people. And there's a great anecdote in a book about them that said Deaver always watched the TV with the sound down because he didn't care what the reporter said. He wanted people saw the pictures, and that's all he cared about. And then TV took over, and then all of a sudden, network television cared less about covering politics because it was expensive, and they could send the cable people to do it, and they did it on the cheap. And now those, I think of these titans, the David Broders, the Tom Oliphants, the Curtis Wilkies, the Johnny Apples of the world. Who are they now? They don't. The people who are the titans now are Rachel Maddow and Anderson Cooper, very talented journalists, but they're not the same group, that was dominant.
No, not.
And there's so many of them that
There's
there
no
isn't
Helen
one.
Thomas. There's no Sam Donaldson. And you told one of the greatest anecdotes I've ever heard about Helen, and with her sitting there, and you said, why are you sitting there? You can tell it. Go ahead. You tell it.
Helen, I'd come to work pretty early, but there were a couple of days every month where I'd walk in and Helen was there, sitting in the chair right outside the press secretary's office at 6 a.m. And the rule was you could come up to that office.
Yeah.
The rule didn't mean you could sit there all day, but Helen was Helen. You don't tell Helen anything. You just let her be. And one morning, she'd been there for 2.5 hours, and I just walked out, and I was like, Helen, I'm not trying to get you to move, but why are you sitting here? And she said, you really don't know? And I said, no, I really don't know. That's why I'm asking. And she said, I can tell based on who comes into your office every morning what's important and what's not. And I can tell by the look on everybody's face whether it's going to be a good day or a bad day for you guys. And I was like, Helen, I'm never going to play poker with you.
Yeah.
We were all, it was just this simple
genius.
thought. And I remember
no
going,
like that today.
I just remember going and round to the other senior staff and saying, use the back door from now on.
Well, I told my very
office had 2 doors. And she couldn't cover both.
My very first day, the first person I met was Helen.
Yeah.
And she was talking to me, and she knew who I was because she knew my family because we're all from Lebanon. She took me to her house, made a wonderful Lebanese dinner. The second person she introduces me to was Sam. And Sam says, Brian, look at that first row in the briefing room there, that very first row. There's more than 200 years of experience there. Listen to all of them. And then he said, and Helen's got 190 of it. And then Helen looked at Sam and said something smart. And Sam said, hey, Helen, it's okay to have an unexpressed thought. And she said, Sam, when it comes to you, I have a lot of unexpressed thoughts. And I did not know what I was going to do the rest of my life, but that day was golden. And then later they took me up to, and Helen sat there and banged on, this was when Larry Speaks, it was Reagan in 85. And she's banging on the door. She said, Larry, get your ass out here and talk to me right now. Now, if I did that, I'd be thrown out of the building. If Sam did that, this was Helen.
Helen used to sit there and to no one in particular gripe about managed news. You guys like to manage news. The news can't be managed. And I was like, well, watch us. But I'll tell you one Sam Donaldson story, and I would hope at
He's
this point
still a good friend.
Yeah, well, anyway, so Sam used to call me every night. My first day as the press secretary, 2 things happened. One was the impeachment hearings opened on the Hill in the House, and Sam Donaldson returned to the White House. In the press room, Sam was the bigger story. And I knew Sam from previous campaigns. I had a nice relationship with him. I knew that most of it was bluster, and we had a good professional relationship. But Sam used to call me every night at about 6 and sort of say, here's what I'm doing tonight. I want to make sure I have the facts right. So he'd go through, is the budget 27% lower? And he'd say, because it's really important to me, I don't make a mistake. And I never changed the tone of any of his speeches, but I might say, no, you confused that with another number. It's actually 24, right. And one night I said, Sam, we didn't have an event after 2:00 today. Why are you asking me this now? And he goes, oh, I don't send my script in until 6:15. I said, why? You could have finished. And he goes, I send it at 6:15 and there's no time for anyone to edit me.
Smart man.
Smart man. He goes, there's all these people who haven't been around as long as I have, who's got all these ideas about what I should be reporting. Well, I take that power right away from them.
See, I wish we had more. I really do wish we had, those kind of people in the press today. He was my mentor. Him and Ellen were my two mentors there when I first got to them.
Yeah, they were. In my own way, I love them both.
Yeah, I do too. Well, listen, I appreciate this, Joe. We got to talk more about it. Unfortunately we're out of time, but I really do appreciate it. I want to thank you for joining us on Reverse Shot, where we take a look at the foibles and the good and the bad and the ugly of today's corporate media, and hopefully gives you an idea of how to watch media, how to read it, and be more of a critical thinker. Because folks, right now, more than any other time, we need critical thinkers. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.